work that we all have in common together tonight. And Mindy believes in our students, right? Many of whom would not have access, wouldn't be able to uproot their lives and move to Abilene and pursue graduate education in a residential setting. And my hunch is that she's not alone. Many, if not all of you, know the grind of advocating for distance education. You've endured the skeptics and the questions regarding academic integrity. You've had the courage to persist when colleagues weren't as supportive as you wanted them to be, or when critics, too many to number. And so I first want to say, as someone who's come late to the game of distance learning, I recognize that I benefit from the decades of hard work from people like you. But I could not be doing the work that I do with our adult online learners at ACU without pioneers and trailblazers and the early martyrs in the online learning game. So to all of you in general, and to Mindy in particular, thank you for your hard work. You are doing good work, work that matters, and you should feel proud. Let me also say what a gift it is to be with you tonight. I hope this is painless for everyone involved. I'm deeply grateful to Dr. Lowe and the organizers for extending this invitation, and I'm not sure how Mindy convinced her peers that I would be a good fit for this year's opening dinner, but I'm deeply grateful, and I hope that she did not oversell my capabilities, and if she did it, you'll be gracious to me. I remember the first time I was asked to pass communion at the little church that raised me outside the city limits in Davenport, Iowa. Growing up in Churches of Christ, we observed communion every week, and volunteers would pass them out, walk up and down the aisles, and we had these little silver trays. And I got through the silver tray of the matzah bread somewhat successfully, and I was feeling proud. And then handed me the silver tray with all the little tiny cups of grape juice, and I was surprised by the weight of it. And immediately my nerves get up and I start shaking as I'm walking to the front row, wide-eyed. I'm noticing the grape juice that's splashing out all the individual cups. And my embarrassment and horror only make it worse as the shaking gets more violent. That by the time I got to the back, there's grape juice everywhere. And it's impossible to discern if a cup is low because someone else has grabbed it and drank it from it, or if it's low just because I've shaken so violently. But after worship, a kind older woman who was my kindergarten Bible school teacher, her name was Jo Leopard, she came up to me and she told me how proud she was of me. And she put her arm around me and she said, "Ben, sometimes the only thing that matters is showing up and being there." I'm fairly certain that you have slightly higher standards for me tonight. I'm just showing up and being here. But forgive me if I do spill a little grape juice here or there tonight. As Mindy mentioned, my role at Dallas is the Associate Dean for Vocational Formation. I feel like my job is describing what my job title is. Basically, my work tries to address the question, how do you help business people and therapists, educators, nurses, clergy, working professionals develop a sense that their work matters, that it matters to the world and that it matters to God. If we believe that God longs for the world to be a place of human flourishing, a place of justice and mercy and hope and peace and joy, then any moment, I want to argue, any moment of human flourishing is a moment that God cares about. So a teacher that attends to the emotional and intellectual and social development of a child isn't just being a good teacher. They're actively participating in God's longing for the world, right? A therapist that creates space for individuals or couples or families to process trauma or dysfunction or broken relationship isn't just being a good therapist. They're embracing God's longing for humans to experience wholeness. And a business person that keeps an orderly and ethical account of an organization's budget and finances isn't just being a good business person. You're helping order the world as God would have it. But I came to this work late in life. I came to the academy late. Before our family moved to Dallas 2.5 years ago, I spent 18 years in congregational ministry in the Pacific Northwest, both Portland and Seattle and Bellingham. And I mention this for two reasons. First off, while I am at a university now, most of my heart still remains in the local church. There's something about these beautiful, dysfunctional, simultaneously full of blessing and curse communities called church. And I'm so glad that I left the politics of church to go to a university where there's no politics, where everyone shares resources openly. Oh, you're low on budget? We're full on budget. Why don't you take some of our money? I can't always explain, but I just have a deep love for churches, especially the small ones. And I think a part of the reason that I've really come to love distance learning and online education is for the ways that it encourages and challenges and strengthens churches in ways that brick and mortar institutions simply are not positioned to do so. But I also mentioned my background as a pastor to frame the posture from which I come to you tonight. Most days I question if I'm a competent academic. I really do. But I think I'm a decent pastor. And I have a core conviction that our work together, our work in Christian higher education and learning, once we strip away the pretense and the competition, need to be seen as the smartest or the best or the hardest working. At the core of what we do together is a pastoral call. A call to welcome and receive and embrace God's kingdom as it breaks into the world. And no matter the work that we might do, whether it's trudging through research, or course development, or instructional design, or expense reports, or staff meetings, or faculty meetings, or God help us, accreditation issues, no matter what the work is, we are never let off the hook to filter all of life through the two great commands, to love God and love neighbor. Never. Good. So when I joined ECU in this online world, I must confess I wasn't sure how I felt about distance education. My life's work had been very local and very particular. And I wondered, could you do formation through an online medium? When so much of my own educational journey had been located in a classroom with peers and professors that I could reach out and touch with my own hands, I wondered if it could be replicated online. I wondered about how one might build a sense of community when the very medium necessitates that students isolate themselves in front of a screen. I wondered about the implications that distance learning had for spiritual formation, or how do we nurture those unplanned interactions that I had in hallways and offices and students' centers, from which residential students benefit, but for the online students, they simply don't have access. Now, I came to this work with great expectation and hope and curiosity, partly because I knew there were people like you who had been prayerfully and diligently been tackling these questions for years, but the questions were still there. And then I started to meet our students. Good. I met Candace, who's a first-generation college student who has picked away at her education slowly but surely. And we meet online, and I see her over the Zoom video or Google Hangouts, and I see all of this ACU paraphernalia, and she talks about the pride of being a wildcat, and I think, goodness, she has far more school spirit than I ever have. But the pride that you sense isn't about the institution. It's about a lifetime of really, really hard work. It's about battling systemic poverty as a young child, a teenager, and young adult. It's about issues of systemic racism that she still experiences. It's about things that I, quite frankly, have no framework to truly understand. But you could see it in her eyes and you could hear it in her voice, this resilience, this inspiring hope from someone who should feel jaded but isn't. This courage that has come from years of toil. And I met Alessandra, a woman in her late 50s who has 5 adult children, and in spite of her lifelong hope of slowing down as an empty nester, found herself guardian and caretaker for her sister's 3 teenage kids. 3 teenagers who have been deeply hurt and wounded in ways I can't even imagine. And in the hours that she's not running one of her nieces or nephews to a school activity or appointment, she's picking away at her doctorate of education. Why? Because she's watched her own children find faith and lose faith and find it again. And she watches her nieces and nephews whose conception of God, born out of their childhood trauma, is that God is a tyrant. And she wants to explore faith formation and that stage of life known as emerging adulthood. And she's brilliant, and she's curious, and she's deeply passionate about exploring how we might better love our children into the faith. And I bet good money that if we opened up the floor, we could begin to tell our own stories of the remarkable human beings that we've met along the way. Those we've encountered in distance learning, those who are amazing people of faith who've endured unspeakable traumas, people who've experienced one hurdle after another, and yet every time they get knocked down, they stand up, they dust themselves off, they take the next courageous step. And with every interaction with students like Candace and students like Alessandra, I find myself less and less consumed by the questions I once had, and more inspired to dive deeper to more of our students' lives and stories. Because this is a part of the good news, that without online education, Candace simply would not have the same opportunity to advance her education, right? That without distance learning, Alessandra would not be able to juggle her responsibilities to her nieces and nephew and still pursue her doctorate of education. And I know I'm speaking to the choir here. I've got a good crowd to say this sort of thing. But the gift of online education is that it makes that which was previously inaccessible, accessible. Over 65% of the students who are enrolled in our programs online at ACU, over 65% are female. And the percentages of students of color and ethnic minorities and students that come from communities that have been traditionally overlooked are far above the averages of most universities, including the residential student population of our own campus in Abilene.
Good.
And it makes a difference. And it makes a difference not only in institutions, it makes a difference for pastors and lay leaders across the country and around the world. The churches that I served for 18 years in the Pacific Northwest were small, anywhere from 75 to 150. 150 was always a stretch, but I would say 150 to impress people. But in the Northwest, if you have a church of 100, you've got a shot of making it. Our doors might stay open, and that's good news. And I moved to Dallas. Or a Tuesday night Bible study for people who knit. It's 100 people, right? The Northwest is just different. Many of my clergy friends, the group that I would gather with once a month, they were forced to be bivocational. Many of them not only got theological degrees online, many of them got degrees in business and education, marriage and family therapy. Why? To help them get more job opportunities so they could keep loving the church that loved them so well. And I know of churches who couldn't even afford a part-time pastor, and so a few of the leaders pursued theological education through certificates and degrees so that they, as lay leaders, could provide thoughtful, theologically informed leadership. In many ways, the accessibility of distance education allows communities where the church is struggling to not only survive, but to gain a new imagination for their life and their context and what God might be up to. This is good news. And when you drive through the city of Federal Way, which is just south of Seattle, right between Seattle and Tacoma. When you drive past a church, but you'll have to look for it. They're not easy to find. But when you do find one, do you know what you often find? Where there once was a thriving English-speaking church in the 70s and 80s and 90s, now sits a community of Christ followers that are Vietnamese, or Russian, or Ukrainian, or Korean, or Samoan, or of Mexican or Latino descent. In an increasingly diverse and globalized world, accessibility matters. And you know this. You wouldn't be here if you didn't believe so, if you didn't think otherwise. But I want to push it a little bit further tonight and suggest that accessibility is not simply for the benefit of those whom we reach, it's for our benefit as well. Or to put it another way, accessibility isn't just because people like Candace and Alessandra need it. It matters because we need Candace and we need Alessandra. And accessibility is the vehicle through which we experience hope and sustainability in this good work that we're involved in. So over the last 6 years, a large chunk of my time and energy has been spent exploring hospitality. Hospitality as we find it in the Hebrew scriptures, in the Christian scriptures, the Old and New Testament. Hospitality as we find it in the person of Jesus. And hospitality as we see it expressed in the life of the church. And it grew out of the experience of the little church that I pastored in Federal Way. That we noticed a posture and instinct that we have that I think is fairly consistent with most churches, and that is, churches tend to be very good about extending hospitality to others, but only on the church's terms and the church's turf, right? Churches have hospitality ministries, which tends to focus on how members, but especially guests, are received when people come into the church building. People identified with the gift of hospitality tend to be those who are good hosts. People who make others feel welcomed and well-fed. And these are good things, right? We want, as Christians, to be welcoming human beings. I'm not discouraging that at all. But it's interesting that this is also the instinct of traditional residential higher education. We expect students to come to our terms and our turf. Sure, they bring their unique stories and capabilities and experiences, but it's still framed within our own experience. And what's interesting is when you look at the biblical witness of hospitality, in both the Hebrew and the Christian scriptures, hospitality is far more this mutual discovery and sharing and learning. Hospitality in God's economy is this space where the role of guest and the role of host is interwoven and unchangeable and at times indiscernible. So in Genesis 18, when Abraham is resting in the shade by the oaks of Mamre and the Lord appears in three strangers, what do Abraham and Sarah do? They're hospitable. Abraham gets up and he runs to them and he gets the finest breads and the finest meats and they give them food and they give them rest. They are the host. The strangers are the guests. But by the end of the narrative, the roles change. And it's the strangers who have something to give that's hard for Abraham and Sarah to receive, and that is the news that she will have a child. From the very beginning, in the story of God's people, hospitality is never a one-way street. It's always a mutual sharing. Or we can look to the prophet Elijah and the widow Zarephath, who has no bread to give when they first meet. And the prophet makes sure in the exchange that the jar of meal and the jug of oil will never run out till the Lord sends rain. And we find in this relationship through the widow, Elijah receives necessary lodging and bread, and through Elijah, the widow receives food for herself and her son. And down the line, what else does she receive when her son is ill? Her son is healed. Hospitality is both extended and received. Or we can look to Elijah's successor, Elisha, and his relationship with the wealthy woman, Shunem. All you Hebrew geeks would get me on that one. But in their relationship, what do you see? He receives lodging and food every time he passes through town, and she receives news of a child, and later on, when the child is sick, Elijah raises that child from the dead. And the life and the ministry of Jesus is no different. Yes, we find him serving as host as he breaks bread and forgives sins and alters social structures, but we also see him as a guest, don't we? As he enters into the homes of tax collectors and sinners, and he receives food on their terms and their turf, receiving the gracious offers of welcome that they have to give. Throughout the biblical witness, the lines between who is guest and who is host is blurred as they both give and they both receive. And one of the gifts that we have in online education is that we aren't requiring students to come solely to us on our terms and our turf, but we are privileged. We're given the gift to actually go to them on their terms and their turf in their contexts. I mean, how exciting is that? We're not just stuck with our boring lives and context. We're not just stuck with the stuff that we know and experience. And yes, we have something to give, and we should be diligent and responsible with that which we bring to our students. But it's hubris. It's the height of narcissism if we refuse to hold a posture of hospitality that says to our students and those whom we serve, we need you. And not just for revenue. We need you to understand the world better and understand God better. We need the unique set of gifts and passions and experiences that only you can bring. We need you because you can teach us something. At the heart of receiving guests and strangers and marginalized is the core belief that God comes with them. And so we cannot stop looking for those that we have historically overlooked and ignored in Christian education. We must confess with great humility over and over again that we actually don't have it all figured out, that we actually need others. So our family lived across the street from Wildwood Elementary in Federal Way, where my 3 kids all went to the elementary school. The church was 1,200 feet from our house. And over the years, the elementary school and the church formed this really remarkable and beautiful relationship, and somewhat in the Northwest, somewhat unheard of, really. And one winter, while I was trying to fill the preaching gap between Advent and Lent, I decided to preach through the story of the Good Samaritan 4 weeks in a row, but from 4 different perspectives. And like most of my sermon series ideas, what felt like a really good idea at the beginning was a terrible idea when I got to the end. Because quite honestly, I picked 4 weeks arbitrarily. I knew I wanted to preach from the perspective of a legal expert. I knew I wanted to preach from the perspective of the priests and Levites. I wanted to also look at the perspective of the man who was left for dead in the ditch, but I honestly didn't have a very good 4th option. I wanted to avoid preaching from the perspective of the Good Samaritan. And so, because it's really the only character left in the story, I decided to slip in the perspective of the innkeeper there at the end of the story, that person that the Good Samaritan brings the wounded man to and tasks him with caring for him until the Good Samaritan returns. And the 4th week arrived, and I sat in my office and I stared at the blank Word document on my computer, desperately wanting something else to do. And thanks be to God, the phone rang. And it was Principal Schwartz. Michael and I had, over the years, developed a pretty good friendship. And he was calling with an urgent but sensitive request. That morning he had discovered that one of the families whose 3 young children attended Wildwood had been without electricity for over 3 months. And it was sensitive because Michael was fairly certain that the parents were undocumented. So he couldn't send them to the normal social service resources that he would other families. And I remember him saying, immigration politics aside, Ben, these are our children. Lumped me into it. These are our children. And no child deserves to be cold. So in a couple hours between staff at the school and the church, we pulled together $800, and we were able to pay both the overdue bill and get enough for the next couple of months. It was this really remarkable, one of the most sort of thin, remarkable moments in my life. And I went back to the blank Word document on my computer with this Good Samaritan sermon from the perspective of the innkeeper, and something that I should have seen long ago, but had been blind to, perhaps by my own privilege and social location, I don't know, but something I'd never seen finally came into view. We tend to think of ourselves as the Good Samaritans, or at the very least the ones who are supposed to be the Good Samaritans. And there's something to that, sure. But with this experience with Michael right in front of me, it struck me that the church, in this moment, wasn't the one that Jesus points to as an exemplary. Rather, it was Michael that Jesus points to, and he leans over to the church and says, "Go and do likewise. Be like him." The church loves to be the hero, but sometimes we're just called to be good innkeepers, to look to the Good Samaritans in our midst. And we were fortunate on that day to receive and share in this small part, the small way of the grace and kindness of Michael. And please forgive me for the overgeneralization. I'm a preacher, I'm prone to it. But we love to be good Samaritans, don't we? We love to be ones who help those who are left for dead in the ditch. And this is a part of the life to which we are called, don't get me wrong. But what if our pursuit to make Christian higher education more accessible isn't simply because we recognize that there are people that this world has left for dead in the ditch who need our help? What if we pursued accessibility because we trust and believe that through it we will meet students like Candace and students like Alessandra, students that Jesus will point to as he leans over to us and says, "Go and do likewise. Be like them." And as any good preacher, I'm very prone to hyperbole. My wife calls it lying sometimes, but I like to say hyperbole. And this may simply be a product of that. I don't think it is, but it may be. But the imagery is striking to me. At a time in higher education when colleges and seminaries and universities all over the United States are in serious financial crisis and in danger of closing their doors if they haven't already, when it seems that the very nature of our institutions beat up and hobbled and at the risk of falling in a ditch and left for dead at the side of the road, wouldn't it be ironic if the very people we have traditionally ignored and overlooked because of their lack of financial resources, or their social location, or their disabilities, or their perceived intellectual struggles, wouldn't it be ironic if they, like the Good Samaritan, who is the unexpected person of mercy in Luke, end up to be the very people who pull our institutions out of the ditch? Wouldn't that be a delightful grace to receive and witness? I mean, this is why we must continue to push the traditional boundaries that define who has access to Christian higher education. We do it as a response to the gospel's call for us to embrace those on the margins of our society, yes. But we also must do it because our very lives depend on it. We need them to show us the way forward, to reveal to us a God who is never static, who cannot be contained, and who consistently shows up in the stranger and the outcast and the marginalized. And it's not going to be easy, right? It will require humility and creativity and courage and a willingness to fail and a willingness to fail again. And we will undoubtedly have detractors and people who criticize and those who think this kind of work waters down education. And all of that is okay because we've been practicing this stuff, haven't we? We know failure and we know criticism and we know the feeling of isolation, but you know what? we're still here. And while we know all of the hard stuff will come, we also know students like Candace and Alessandra. Students that we expected would be our guests in the classroom who turned out to be the gracious hosts as they taught us new things about the world and new things about God. And by God, we have each other, don't we? Gathered here with these people who remind us that we haven't lost our mind completely, and partially, but not completely. As we encourage and inspire one another to imagine new possibilities in distance learning. And I don't have any good answers for you, unfortunately. But that's why there's breakout sessions. That's where we will undoubtedly have all of the right answers. I give you my guarantee, all of the answers will be given in the breakout sessions. I'm being a little playful, but also a little slightly serious. Not because they actually have the right answers, but rather because they're looking towards the right people. I mean, look through the conference roadmap. And who do you see at the center of this conversation? Non-English speakers, blind, those who live in the global south, adults who have ADHD, and the list goes on. These are the people, those on the margins, who will show us the way forward. These are the people in whom and through whom our future will unfold. And this, my friends, is good news. Let me end with this blessing. May the God who began a good work in you be faithful to give you strength, patience, and wisdom as you continue this good work and chart new territory. May the presence of the Spirit remind you amidst failure and criticism and uncertainty that these things are not reflective of who you are. You are God's beloved, holy and dearly loved. And may the peace of Christ be with you as you not only extend that which you have to offer the world and your students, but also as you receive that which others have to give to you. Sometimes you won't be the Good Samaritan in search of those to save. Sometimes you will be the one who needs saving. And that's okay. Receive it with grace, humility, and deep gratitude. And be gracious to yourself when it all goes wrong and you make a mess of things. Because at the end of the day, Joe Leopard may in fact be right. Sometimes just showing up and being there is all that matters. I'm grateful to be with you tonight. Thanks.